I would like to bring you up to date on a campaign that has been waged now for almost 8 years. A campaign aimed at freeing 70 million people from communist tyranny. This was the Berlin airlift, 1948. The communists severed all supply routes into West Berlin. But planes from the free world kept the city alive for over a year. This victory belonged to communication. The free world won because it refused to lose contact with a beleaguered people. 1949, the Soviets had swallowed up 9 countries in Eastern Europe. Among them were Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Swallowed them, but not digested them. Here again, there was need for action. Again, there was the problem of saving a beleaguered people, this time 70 million of them. But these people could only be saved if their courage was sustained, their hope for freedom, and pride in their national heritages. As long as they were not forced to think like slaves, they could never be shaped in the image of Russian communism. Again, the need was for communication. Americans took the first step. They donated a freedom bell, like their own Liberty Bell, to the city of Berlin. And from this beginning, General Lucius Clay, who had masterminded the Berlin airlift, joined with a group of private American citizens in building another kind of airlift. Radio Free Europe, a lifeline of free ideas and truthful news for the captive people who had been cut off from the free world by an iron curtain. To do its job, Radio Free Europe needed help from the American people. And so, even as Radio Free Europe was being born, so was the Crusade for Freedom, the American organization which built and still supports Radio Free Europe. A lifeline had been formed. At one end was the American public supporting the Crusade for Freedom. Then there was Radio Free Europe and its staff of American experts and highly respected exiles, broadcasting night and day to those on the other end, the captive people behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviets' own cameras recorded the terrible events of these early years. The defendants at this mock trial, including Bulgarian patriot Nicola Petkov, were hanged. The people's opposition had been wiped out. Over 1 million died in bloody purges. Churches were closed. Here, Cardinal Mindszenty brought to trial. The communists' goal was to kill the concept of freedom and to indoctrinate a new generation with atheism and hatred of the free world. Children were a prime target. Parroting words supplied by the Kremlin.
Повяжешь галстук, береги его, он ведь с нашим знаменем света одного, а под этим знаменем в бой идут бойцы. Пионеры, на дело универсальном пункте готовы?
This was 1950. The organization of Radio Free Europe gathering up-to-the-minute news, listening in on the communists' own broadcasts, talking with escapees from behind the Iron Curtain, analyzing propaganda the communists were feeding the people in their own publications. The organization of RFE had already come a long way, and as the effectiveness of its broadcasts increased, the Reds spent huge sums trying to jam reception in the captive country. But contributions from the American people permitted Radio Free Europe to build more and bigger transmitters, to develop saturation broadcasting techniques with all transmitters going at once, blasting through the curtain of jamming. When Stalin died in 1953, RFE was on the air with news of his death hours before the communist radio. After his death, communist leaders made a few uncertain promises to the captive peoples who, unfortunately, took them as signs of weakness. These are riots in East Berlin, forerunners of future uncontrolled violence in Soviet slave nations. RFE warned the people that physical violence was suicide. It called for patience and constantly reported that the free world would support whatever peaceful pressure they could bring to bear for their own freedom. Throughout these terrible years, disheartened people were escaping through the Iron Curtain by the thousands. Important people, too. I'd like you to meet one of them. Professor Korowicz, formerly professor of international law and a Polish delegate to the United Nations when he fled to freedom right in New York City. After his escape, he appeared before our Congress and broadcast a powerful message over Radio Free Europe. Professor Korowicz of Fletcher University, Massachusetts.
After my broadcast over Radio Free Europe, I was deeply moved by a letter I received from my former students in Krakow, urging me to continue to work for the freedom of Poland. The Polish people hate Russian oppression, and their struggle for complete freedom from Kremlin rule will continue.
The real changes behind the Iron Curtain date back to the end of 1954, when the Kremlin was finally forced to change its propaganda line. The captive people had been bled white, but still they resisted. Now the communists began talking about the rights of free nations and the rights of the working people, even as they tried to tighten controls over their puppet rulers. Radio Free Europe stuck to its task, constantly beaming the truth to the captive people and showing them how to oppose their rulers without endangering their own lives. 1955, the hopes of the free world were raised by the First Geneva Conference, but most of these hopes were dashed at the Second Geneva meeting. The Happiness Boys, as they were now known, continued to act benevolently, even beamish. Behind the Iron Curtain, the new look continued to develop, still with little direct benefit to the hungry and downtrodden people. 1956, at the 20th Party Congress in Moscow, Comrade Khrushchev read his now famous indictment of Stalin, a record of evil unequaled in world history. The communist god was destroyed. Confusion reigned. Again, Radio Free Europe, after carefully checking its information, broadcast Comrade Khrushchev's speech to the captive countries long before the communists admitted that the speech had been delivered. Then cracks in the Iron Curtain began to appear. Here is Poznan. Polish workers rioted for bread and freedom. And here, Budapest. The Hungarian people openly rebelled against overwhelming Russian power. Throughout this rebellion and 5 days of Hungarian freedom, Radio Free Europe cautioned the people against unnecessary sacrifice. But the pent-up hatred of secret police and Russian tyranny was far too great for reason to take hold. Hungary again alerted the world to Soviet inhumanity. Meanwhile, Poland forged a step toward freedom. But few in the free world could trust that Soviet-granted concessions meant real freedom. Today, Radio Free Europe, with its 29 powerful transmitters and relay stations, broadcasting 3,000 hours a week to the captive countries, continues to keep the pressure on the communists, forcing them to make new concessions and fostering the spirit of freedom among the oppressed people. The money and moral support to build this lifeline to freedom has come from the American people through the Crusade for Freedom. Until completely free communication, entirely free elections, and guaranteed freedom of worship are finally won by the captive peoples, we must keep this airlift going. We must sustain this lifeline to freedom. Send your contributions to Crusade for Freedom, care of your local postmaster. It's that easy. Crusade for Freedom, care of your local postmaster.